welcome to the deep dive. We are really thrilled you're here with us today.
Absolutely.
Before we get into anything else, though, if you enjoy the insights we uncover here, please make sure to like and subscribe to the show. It really helps us out, and it ensures you never miss out on the knowledge we're extracting for you. Now, let's talk about you. Specifically, if you're a man navigating the modern world, perhaps interested in the men's rights space, or if you consider yourself part of the Redpill Manosphere, today's mission is custom-tailored entirely for you.
Yeah, today's a big one.
We are unpacking a comprehensive blueprint designed to help you understand the shifting dynamics of our culture and, how to actually thrive within it. We're looking at a very specific, highly discussed text today. We are reviewing the ebook Redpill Mastery, the definitive guide to winning at life by Conrad Riker. And I want to tell you right out of the gate, you should check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy the book. Also, make sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack. What we're doing today is just giving you a taste of the extensive strategies found in this ebook.
Just a taste.
We're going to explore some really fascinating concepts, but the full experience, the actual step-by-step blueprint, is waiting for you in those pages. So make sure you go grab a copy.
Because it is an incredibly massive text to unpack. I mean, it covers just a vast amount of ground. Our mission today is to explore Riker's arguments regarding the history of what he describes as our captured institutions, the erosion of traditional masculinity, and his step-by-step guide to personal mastery.
Yeah.
But, and this is absolutely vital, we need to set the stage with a very clear disclaimer for you. The source material we are diving into today contains highly politically charged content.
Totally.
It deals heavily with critiques of feminism, Marxism, and modern social justice movements. And we want to make it unequivocally clear to you that we are not taking sides here.
Right. We are not taking sides.
We're not endorsing the viewpoints of the author, nor are we condemning them. Our role is to act entirely as your impartial guides. We are here to objectively report and analyze the ideas contained within the original text so that you can fully understand the author's perspective and, the complex arguments he's making.
Exactly. We are just the messengers here, breaking down the text so you can evaluate it for yourself. So let's map out where we're going. We're going to start by looking at the foundational metaphor of the book, which is the concept of the red pill versus the blue pill.
Matrix metaphor, yeah.
Right. And from there, we're going to trace Riker's historical argument about how cultural institutions were fundamentally altered over the last century. We'll look at his critique of modern feminism and its impact on traditional masculinity. And then, once we have that historical context, we're going to get into the highly actionable material. The psychology of the red-pilled man, strategies for building wealth, optimizing health, and finally, how to navigate the modern social matrix. That includes networking, mentorship, and the reality of modern dating.
Which is huge.
Yeah, it's a lot. Let's start right at the foundation. The author heavily borrows a metaphor from the sci-fi classic The Matrix. The premise is that if you take the blue pill, you remain blissfully ignorant of society's shortcomings. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe.
Which, according to the author, means accepting a feminized, subservient male role.
Right. But if you take the red pill, you wake up to the uncomfortable truths about media manipulation, systemic misandry, and the suppression of male nature.
And what's fascinating here is how Riker elevates what was essentially a popular internet meme into a really comprehensive life philosophy. The source text traces the origin of the term to various online forums over the last decade, but it notes how it's evolved from this niche internet subculture into a serious framework for rejecting mainstream or conventional beliefs.
Yeah.
The book asserts that the blue pill conditioning is not some accidental byproduct of modern life or just, the natural progression of a highly digital society. Riker argues that it is by design.
That's a key point. Yeah. By design.
He claims that mainstream media, the education system, and popular culture are orchestrated to keep men as what he terms perpetual teenagers.
I want to pause on that idea of the perpetual teenager because it seems so central to his argument. What does that actually look like in practice, according to the text? Like, why would a society or an institution want men to remain in a state of extended adolescence?
Well, according to the framework Riker lays out, the idea is that if men are kept in a state of extended adolescence, meaning they are unsure of their masculine identity, they lack clear purpose, and they're highly reliant on external validation, they become much more pliable. They're easier to control.
Wow.
The blue pill narrative, as described in the text, tells men to silence their masculine instincts, give up traditional roles of leadership and protection, and submit to a world governed by what the author terms toxic feminism. The perpetual teenager is someone who consumes rather than creates. He's distracted by endless entertainment, video games, superficial social media validation, rather than focusing on building a legacy, acquiring hard assets, or developing formidable physical and mental skills.
So it's about distraction and docility.
Exactly. The author argues that a society of fully actualized, independent, strong men is very difficult to manipulate, whereas a society of overgrown boys is highly susceptible to consumerism and ideological compliance.
That paints a very specific picture. And the book goes into heavy detail about the psychological toll this takes on a man. Riker claims that men who accept this blue pill narrative, who try to, fit themselves into this box, suffer immensely. Their once strong sense of identity is replaced by confusion and uncertainty.
Yeah, they just drift.
Right, they end up trapped in relationships where they feel undervalued, and they get stuck in unfulfilling careers with no clear path to advancement because they've basically been taught that ambition and aggression are somehow problematic.
And he brings in data to back this up.
He does. To back this up, the author brings in some incredibly sobering statistics that you just can't really ignore. He cites data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, highlighting that men are nearly 4 times more likely to die by suicide than women, and that suicide is the second leading cause of death for men aged 10 to 34.
Those statistics serve as the ultimate proof of his thesis that the blue pill is not just limiting it, it is actively harmful. The text uses these numbers to argue that the current societal narrative is literally fatal for a significant portion of the male population.
Yeah, it's life or death in his view.
To bring this down to a human level, the book presents an extensive case study of a man named Tom.
Oh, right, Tom.
Yeah, Tom is described as a classic example of a man who bought completely into the blue pill ideology. He accepted the cultural messaging that men were inherently flawed, oppressive, or toxic, and he allowed this belief to dictate his behavior. In his professional life, Tom was constantly stepping on eggshells, apologizing for his ambition, and allowing less qualified peers to pass him by because he didn't want to appear aggressive. In his personal life, he lacked boundaries and felt weak and dispensable.
Right, the text describes him as basically a ghost in his own life. But then the book details his transformation. According to Riker, when Tom redpilled, he was forced to confront this toxic notion he had internalized. He began to see himself not as a weak, inferior man who needed to apologize for his existence, but as a powerful, capable individual with a biological imperative to lead and provide.
A total paradigm shift.
Yeah, and this transformation in his perspective supposedly allowed him to completely overhaul his life. He started speaking up in meetings, setting hard boundaries in his relationships, and demanding respect. The author uses Tom to show that rejecting the blue pill isn't just about adopting a new political ideology. It's a matter of profound personal survival and mental health. It's about reclaiming a lost identity.
And if we look at how Riker asks the reader to apply this to their own life, he challenges you to examine the culture you consume every day. He asks you to extrapolate on how popular media subtly reinforces this blue pill conditioning.
Like movies and TV.
Exactly. He points to the archetypes we see on screens. For decades, the classic role was the strong, decisive, and confident male archetype. Think of the leading men from mid-century cinema. But Riker argues that this archetype has been systematically dismantled and replaced.
Replaced by what?
What we get instead, according to the text, is the sensitive, self-deprecating, indecisive nice guy, or the bumbling, incompetent father figure who constantly needs to be rescued or corrected by his much smarter wife or children.
Yeah, think about the last 5 major sitcoms or commercials you watch. How often is the dad portrayed as a complete idiot who can't figure out how to use a washing machine while the mom rolls her eyes and fixes everything?
It's a massive trope.
It is. The book argues that this isn't just lazy writing, right? It's a constant, steady bombardment of media messaging that supposedly diminishes the importance of masculinity. It conditions men from a very young age to view themselves as inherently flawed or inherently ridiculous if they exhibit traditional masculine traits like stoicism, aggression, or a desire for leadership.
You're basically taught that being a strong man is a punchline.
Exactly. Which naturally leads to a massive question. If this blue pill conditioning is so pervasive, and if it's intentionally designed to keep men compliant and self-doubting, where did it actually come from? Like, who designed it?
Right. And Riker doesn't just point to vague organic societal shifts. He doesn't just say times change. He points to very specific historical movements and philosophical schools of thought.
Let's get into that.
The text argues that understanding why this blue pill conditioning exists requires a deep dive into history, specifically looking at how our major cultural institutions were fundamentally altered over the course of the 20th century.
And this is where the book's historical analysis really takes off. Riker dives deep into the emergence of what we commonly call social justice warriors, or SJWs, and he traces their ideological roots all the way back to the 1920s to a group known as the Frankfurt School. We're talking about thinkers like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and Herbert Marcuse. According to Riker, these were exiled German thinkers who formed an intellectual collective to challenge conventional ideas about society. But the author argues their goal was much larger than just academic debate. They wanted to dismantle Western capitalist power structures.
Right.
And here's the key shift. Instead of doing it through traditional economic Marxism, which focuses on the working class seizing the means of production, they blended Marxist theory with psychoanalysis and sociology. They targeted culture.
To put this in very accessible terms, imagine society is a computer. Traditional economic Marxism tried to smash the hardware, the banks, the factories, the physical infrastructure of capitalism.
The actual physical stuff.
Exactly. But the thinkers at the Frankfurt School realized that the hardware was too resilient in the West. People liked their standard of living. So according to Riker's interpretation, they decided to rewrite the software instead.
The software.
The software is the culture. It's the media, the educational system, the arts, the family structure. If you can rewrite the cultural software, eventually the hardware will just hand itself over voluntarily. This intellectual framework birthed what the book calls critical theory.
I want to make sure we really understand how Riker defines critical theory because it's a term thrown around a lot today.
Yeah.
How does the book explain it in practical terms?
As explained in the source material, critical theory is a sociological and philosophical framework that views all of society, culture, and politics strictly through the lens of power dynamics, specifically oppressor versus oppressed.
Right.
It operates on the core assumption that traditional power structures, traditional norms, and traditional institutions are inherently oppressive and must be relentlessly critiqued and deconstructed. Nothing is taken at face value. Everything is a hidden mechanism of oppression.
So it's constant suspicion of everything traditional.
Exactly. The book traces how this theory, over several decades, migrated from obscure academic circles and steadily infiltrated mainstream academia, then the media, and finally the legal and corporate systems. Over time, it morphed into what Riker calls modern cultural Marxism. The author claims that the SJWs of today are essentially the unwitting foot soldiers or enforcers of this cultural Marxist ideology, hell-bent on eradicating any ideas, behaviors, or traditions they deem problematic.
And the author is incredibly specific about the tactical playbook these enforcers use. The book details how they leverage shaming, gaslighting, and victimhood narratives to completely silence dissent. We see this manifested in cancel culture and public ostracization, which creates a digital scarlet letter for anyone who steps out of line or questions the prevailing narrative.
Yeah, you see it everywhere online.
Riker points out that these activists use very specific trigger words and dog whistle phrases like the term microaggression. The brilliant and insidious thing about a concept like a microaggression, from the book's perspective, is that it subtly categorizes people as perpetrators of bigotry, even when there is absolutely no conscious intent.
Which is wild if you think about it.
It means you can be guilty of a crime you didn't even know you were committing, which forces everyone to constantly self-censor and walk on eggshells.
The book claims that academic institutions have become the primary breeding grounds for this ideology. Riker specifically names disciplines like gender studies, critical race theory, and queer theory. These fields, the author argues, do not exist to discover objective truth. They exist to promote a hypercritical analysis of society that fundamentally pits different demographics against each other. It's a zero-sum game of grievance. To illustrate the danger of these controlled narratives, the author actually quotes Malcolm X. Yeah, the quote used in the text is, "The media is the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and to make the guilty innocent, and that's power, because they control the minds of the masses."
Using Malcolm X in this context is a really interesting choice by the author. How does Riker apply that quote to his larger point about cultural Marxism?
He uses it to underscore how cultural Marxists and SJWs manipulate public perception through sheer media influence and repetition. They have the power to take a minor, isolated incident, blow it completely out of proportion, and present it as undeniable proof of widespread systemic oppression. Conversely, they can completely ignore or suppress stories that contradict their overarching narratives. This creates a pervasive climate of fear, where people are afraid to speak their minds because the media apparatus can instantly frame them as the villain.
It's all about controlling the narrative.
Yes. If we look closely at the author's perspective on identity politics, he argues that dividing people into rigid groups based on race, gender, or sexual orientation fosters a permanent culture of victimhood. It creates an inescapable us versus them narrative that thrives on resentment and completely undermines the concept of individual responsibility and merit.
Right, because if your failures are always the result of an oppressive system, you never have to take accountability for your own life choices.
Exactly.
The book argues that by framing every single social disagreement in the language of guilt, trauma, and oppression, these activists make rational, evidence-based discourse impossible. You end up with a society where real, complex, individual human beings are pushed aside in favor of sweeping generalizations and collective identity politics. So if we follow the book's logic, these institutions, the media, the universities, the legal system, have been fundamentally captured by an ideology that views traditional structures as oppressive. And according to Riker, the ultimate traditional structure they want to dismantle is the traditional male role,
which is the core of his critique.
This brings us to a massive component of the book's thesis, the critique of modern feminism and what the author calls the war on traditional masculinity.
The book spends a highly significant amount of time unpacking its working definition of feminism and what the author views as its catastrophic unintended consequences on men, the family unit, and society at large. Now, the text does acknowledge the historical feminist movement of the 18th and 19th century.
It does.
Yes, it references pioneers like Mary Wollstonecraft, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony. The author concedes that these early waves of feminism were focused on fundamental, tangible rights things like the right to vote, the right to own property independently, and access to higher education.
Okay.
However, Riker draws a very sharp, uncompromising line between that historical movement and the modern incarnation of feminism. He argues that while the movement initially aimed for legal and social equality, it has mutated over the last few decades into a skewed, hostile narrative that actively demonizes masculinity, slapping labels like toxic on innate male behaviors.
Let's really unpack this concept of the patriarchal society as the book presents it, because that is the central boogeyman in the modern feminist narrative. Riker acknowledges that historically men held the majority of political and economic power, and that they acted as the primary providers and protectors of their families and communities.
Right.
But the book argues that modern feminism views this traditional setup as a malicious, calculated system of oppression designed to keep women subjugated. Riker completely rejects this premise. To illustrate his counter-argument, the author brings in a quote from Jordan Peterson, the clinical psychologist and author. Peterson is quoted in the text stating that the idea of historical female oppression is an appalling theory and a completely fake theory.
And the inclusion of Peterson's perspective is crucial to understanding Riker's argument here. The book uses this to assert that for the vast majority of human history, men and women were not engaged in a bitter gender war for dominance.
Right.
Rather, they simply had distinct, biologically driven, and highly complementary roles. These roles were not designed by a cabal of men to oppress women. They were designed by the harsh realities of nature for the purpose of survival and societal stability.
Necessity, basically.
Exactly. Men, being generally physically stronger and not burdened by the physical demands of pregnancy and nursing, took on the dangerous roles of hunting, building, and fighting. Women took on the equally vital roles of child-rearing and community building. Riker's position is that framing this historical reality as oppression is a modern luxury born out of a safe, industrialized society that has completely forgotten how hard survival used to be.
The author also brings in Camille Paglia, the American academic and social critic, to critique modern feminism. According to the text, Paglia argues that an obsession with sexual violence within modern feminism has unleashed a counterproductive hysteria. This hysteria, the book claims, skews the contemporary understanding of masculinity, painting all male sexuality and aggression as inherently predatory or dangerous. And Riker doesn't just point to fringe activists. He points to major institutions adopting this viewpoint.
This is where he goes after the APA.
He heavily critiques the guidelines released by the American Psychological Association. Specifically, he targets their guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men. The text notes that the APA identifies core aspects of traditional masculinity, such as stoicism, competitiveness, aggression, self-reliance, and a desire for status as potentially harmful.
This is a pivotal moment in the book's argument. Riker holds up these APA guidelines as the ultimate, glaring example of institutional capture. Here you have a major ostensibly objective scientific and psychological body officially pathologizing natural male traits. From the clinical perspective of the APA, extreme stoicism might prevent a man from seeking necessary mental health treatment, and extreme competitiveness might lead to antisocial behavior. But Riker interprets this much more broadly. He argues that the APA is not just warning against extremes. They are fundamentally telling boys and men that their natural biological instincts are wrong, disordered, and need to be medicated or socialized out of them.
And think about how confusing that is for a young man growing up today. You're essentially being told by the highest authorities that your basic nature is a problem to be solved.
Exactly.
But Riker pushes back hard against this. The text argues that returning to traditional male roles, being the strong protector, the reliable provider, the stoic leader, isn't about oppressing women or returning to the Dark Ages. The text claims it's about aligning with our deepest biological roots. It argues that for thousands of generations, a man's role as a provider ensured the financial and physical stability needed to raise the next generation, while his role as a protector shielded his community from external threats. The author asserts that trying to feminize men or trying to push a completely gender-neutral society only accelerates cultural decay.
The book's stance is that a red-pilled man doesn't lose his individuality by embracing these roles. Rather, he understands and accepts the heavy responsibilities society historically assigned to his gender, because he recognizes that those roles ensure societal stability and, crucially, align with his own genetic wiring.
He finds purpose in that responsibility.
He finds purpose in the burden of responsibility. However, the author makes it abundantly clear that swimming against the current of modern culture to embrace these traditional roles is incredibly difficult. Resisting the mainstream narrative, ignoring the media programming, and rejecting the comforting illusions of the blue pill requires immense mental fortitude. It's not an easy path. It's a path of constant resistance.
And that reality, the difficulty of this path, leads us directly into the actionable core of the book. Once you understand the history and the landscape, how do you actually survive it?
Right, what do you do?
Riker provides a comprehensive psychological toolkit for the reader. This explores the psychology of the red-pilled man. According to the book, to survive and thrive in a culture that is actively working against your natural instincts and telling you that your masculinity is toxic, you have to completely master your own mind. You have to build an impenetrable mental fortress. Riker outlines two dual pillars of red pill psychology: rationality and emotional intelligence, or EQ. Let's start with rationality because it's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but Riker gives it a very specific operational definition.
Yes, the book defines rationality not just as being smart, but as the rigorous discipline of making decisions based strictly on empirical facts, evidence, and cold logic, rather than yielding to societal dogma, peer pressure, or emotional manipulation.
Facts over feelings.
Exactly. A rational man looks at the reality of a situation, regardless of how uncomfortable it makes him or others feel. To help the reader cultivate this, Riker details specific cognitive biases that are hardwired into the human brain and can completely derail your thinking if left unchecked.
Let's unpack some of these biases because they are fascinating. For instance, he talks extensively about the sunk cost fallacy. Imagine you buy a $15 ticket to see a 3-hour movie. 30 minutes in, you realize it is the worst movie you've ever seen.
We've all been there.
Right, but you stay for the remaining 2.5 hours miserable the entire time simply because you don't want to waste the $15 you already spent. That is the sunk cost fallacy, persisting in a failing endeavor just because you've already invested time, money, or emotion into it.
So common.
But Riker applies this to massive life decisions. Think about a man who has been in a toxic, dead-end relationship for 5 years. He knows it's draining him, he knows it's not leading anywhere good, but he stays because he feels he's already invested half a decade into the woman. Or a man who stays in a miserable corporate career just because he spent 4 years getting a degree in that specific field. The rational, red-pilled man, according to the text, recognizes the sunk cost fallacy and has the ruthless logic to cut his losses and walk away, regardless of past investment.
Another major cognitive trap the book highlights is confirmation bias. This is the human tendency to actively seek out, remember, and favor information that confirms your pre-existing beliefs, while simultaneously ignoring, dismissing, or forgetting evidence that contradicts those beliefs.
Right.
If you believe the economy is crashing, you will only read articles about failing businesses and ignore data showing job growth. The author argues that in the age of algorithms and social media echo chambers, confirmation bias is deadlier than ever.
Oh, for sure.
To combat these ingrained biases, the book suggests practical exercises. It mentions online rationality hubs and communities, citing places like Reddit's Change My Views subreddit and the forum Less Wrong. Riker encourages men to engage in these spaces, not to argue and win, but to stress test their own beliefs. The goal is to engage in constructive debate and possess the intellectual humility to revise your beliefs when presented with superior evidence.
But rationality is only half the equation, and this is where the book challenges a very prevalent cultural stereotype. If you ask the average person on the street to describe a red-pilled man, they might picture someone who is angry, bitter, completely devoid of empathy, or just cold and robotic.
Right, that's the cliche.
They picture someone who hates women and just stews in his own resentment. However, Riker posits that this is a fundamental misunderstanding. He argues that true, actualized masculinity requires extremely high emotional intelligence. He defines EQ as the ability to acutely recognize and understand your own emotions, as well as the emotions of the people around you, and crucially, to act effectively without being controlled by those emotions.
The book goes to great lengths to frame emotional regulation, not as some modern, sensitive therapeutic trait, but as a deeply traditional, ancient warrior trait.
Yeah, that's an interesting spin.
The author uses historical examples to drive this point home. The text refers to the historical figure of Vercingetorix. Within the context of the book's narrative, Vercingetorix is highlighted as a warrior who faced insurmountable odds in the arena of war against the Roman Empire. Riker focuses on the accounts of his ability to maintain absolute calm, projecting stoic leadership and controlling his internal terror and despair when it was a matter of life or death for his people. The author argues that panicking, throwing a tantrum, or lashing out in anger are signs of low EQ and weak masculinity. True strength is feeling the emotion, feeling the fear or the anger, but remaining the master of your actions.
Right. The book contrasts that ancient warrior calmness with a very modern, relatable example of a man who lacks both rationality and EQ. The text describes a hypothetical modern businessman who is blinded by his own ego and confirmation bias. He ignores contradictory data about a company he wants to acquire because he's emotionally attached to the idea of the deal.
Sounds familiar.
When his advisor is trying to warn him, he loses his temper, lashes out, and makes a disastrous, impulsive financial investment that ruins his firm. The profound point Riker is making is that if you let your emotions, your ego, or your biases control you, you will lose.
Exactly.
You lose whether you're fighting with a sword in a gladiator arena or fighting with capital in a corporate boardroom. A red-pilled man uses high EQ to empathize, to read the room, and to lead others effectively, and he uses ruthless rationality to make evidence-based choices.
But the book makes it emphatically clear that possessing a strong mind, while essential, is only the foundational layer. You cannot just sit in a room perfectly rational and emotionally intelligent and expect your life to improve.
Right, you need action.
You have to translate that internal mental fortitude into external reality. A red-pilled man must build a life of absolute, uncompromising self-reliance. This brings us to a major, highly actionable portion of the text, building the red-pilled empire. This section focuses heavily on wealth creation, habit formation, and physical health. The book provides an extensive, practical blueprint for building independence, starting with financial mastery.
Because if you don't control your money, you don't control your life.
Very true.
Riker emphasizes the absolute importance of moving away from trading time for money and focusing on creating passive income streams. He advocates for avoiding unnecessary consumer debt at all costs. No massive car loans for status symbols, no crippling credit card debt for designer clothes. Fundamentally, he demands that the reader change how they view money entirely. In this red-pilled philosophy, money isn't about buying luxury items to impress people you don't like. Money is purely a tool for freedom. It is the ultimate leverage for gaining control over your time, your location, and your choices, allowing you to completely escape the influence that captured institutions or toxic corporate environments might have over you. If you have FU money, you can't be canceled or coerced.
To illustrate what this financial independence looks like in practice, the text highlights several case studies. It extensively references J.D. Roth, the creator of the early personal finance blog Get Rich Slowly. The book uses Roth as a prime example of a man who adopted an aggressive, disciplined saving and investing strategy, focusing on index funds and cutting frivolous expenses, and managed to reach financial independence and essentially retire by the age of 35.
Incredible.
The author uses this to show that building wealth isn't about getting lucky with a startup, it's about systemic discipline. But to get to that level of systemic discipline and wealth, you have to fundamentally master your time and your daily habits. Riker dives deep into the neuroscience and mechanics of the habit loop.
Let's really break down this habit loop because it's arguably the most practical tool in the entire book. The loop consists of three parts: a cue, a routine, and a reward. Give me a concrete example of how the book suggests a man might use this to fix a failing area of his life.
Let's take a very common scenario Riker addresses: tech addiction and lethargy. A man comes home from a stressful day at his corporate job. The feeling of stress and walking through his front door is the cue. His established routine is to immediately collapse on the couch, open a beer, and mindlessly scroll through TikTok or watch Netflix for 3 hours to numb his brain.
Sounds like a lot of guys.
Yeah. The reward is a temporary, artificial spike in dopamine and a brief escape from the stress. Riker explains that you cannot just delete the routine through sheer willpower. The brain's craving for the reward is too strong. Instead, the red-pilled man must hack the loop.
Hacks loop, okay.
He keeps the cue arriving home stressed, and the desired reward stress relief and dopamine. But he forces a new routine. When he walks in the door, instead of grabbing a beer, he immediately puts on his running shoes and sprints for 20 minutes, or he lifts heavy weights. He still gets the stress relief and the endorphin and dopamine hit the reward, but the routine is now building his physical empire rather than destroying his mental focus.
That is a phenomenal breakdown, and the author brings in several heavy hitters from the productivity and self-improvement space to reinforce these strategies. He heavily cites Tim Ferriss, the author of The 4-Hour Workweek, positioning Ferriss as the ultimate modern example of time management, lifestyle design, and aggressive automation.
Oh yeah, Ferriss is key here.
The book details how Ferriss relentlessly automates his business processes, outsources his email management to virtual assistants, and uses strict constraints to build his empire while maintaining total freedom over his schedule. Ferriss's famous morning routine, which involves making his bed, meditation, journaling, and light exercise, is highlighted as a perfectly engineered habit loop that sets the trajectory for a victorious day.
The text doesn't stop there. It synthesizes methodologies from across the productivity spectrum. It mentions David Allen's famous getting things done methodology, which advocates for getting every single task and idea out of your head and into an external organized system so your brain is free to think, not just remember.
That's huge for mental clarity.
Absolutely. Riker also brings in concepts from James Clear, author of Atomic Habits, noting how Clear used microscopic daily habit tracking to recover from a severe injury, lose massive amounts of weight, and build a highly lucrative writing career. The book even gets into the weeds of practical digital implementation, suggesting specific software tools for the reader, like using Trello or Notion for organizing complex personal projects, and using Zapier to automate repetitive digital workflows so the reader can focus purely on high-leverage tasks.
I appreciate how granular and actionable the text gets, but building the empire isn't just about accumulating capital and optimizing productivity apps on your laptop. It is heavily reliant on optimizing the physical machine, your body. The book extrapolates extensively on the physiological side of the red-pilled life.
It does.
Riker argues that prioritizing rigorous physical fitness and practical self-defense, specifically mentioning disciplines like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Muay Thai, or boxing, is an absolute non-negotiable necessity. And here is where it ties beautifully back to the book's core philosophical premise. The author states that in a modern world where men are implicitly expected to be soft, compliant, and physically weak, building a formidable physical body is literally an act of rebellion. It is a rejection of a society that wants you docile.
It's a very powerful framing. Riker makes it clear that hitting the gym isn't just about vanity or aesthetics. It's not about looking good for an Instagram selfie. It's about forging iron discipline, achieving mental clarity, and having the sheer undeniable physical competence to protect yourself and your loved ones in a world that is fundamentally dangerous. A man who knows he can physically handle himself carries a different energy into a boardroom, into a negotiation, and into a relationship. But this raises the final major question of the book. If we connect this intense focus on personal excellence to the external world, we have to ask. Once a man has mastered his own mind, secured his money, and built a capable physical body, how does he effectively navigate complex human relationships in a hostile society?
Exactly. You can't just live in a cave with your index funds and your barbells.
This brings us to the final major section of our deep dive, navigating the social matrix. This section covers the strategies for networking, the critical importance of mentorship, and arguably the most fraught topic for modern men, the highly digital, often treacherous modern dating landscape.
Let's start with the professional and social side.
The book argues that deliberately building a red-pilled network is absolutely vital. Because society is increasingly polarized and culturally Marxist ideologies are so prevalent in the workplace, Riker says it is more important than ever to surround yourself with a tight circle of like-minded, high-value men who share your foundational values. You need a tribe that can shield you from the negative influences of the broader culture and hold you accountable to your goals.
And the book brings empirical data to back up the profound power of this kind of strategic networking and mentorship. It cites a Harvard Business Review statistic noting that a staggering 75% of professionals believe that seeking advice from experienced mentors positively and significantly impacts their long-term career success and trajectory.
75% is a lot.
It's massive. Riker points to the career of Elon Musk as a masterclass in navigating the professional social matrix. The text analyzes how Musk didn't just build rockets. He systematically built a robust, fiercely loyal network of brilliant fellow entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, and strategic partners, often referred to as the PayPal Mafia, to propel highly risky companies like SpaceX and Tesla to unprecedented global heights. Musk's network was his ultimate safety net and springboard.
But let's be completely real for a second.
Yeah.
While the networking and the money are important, the part of the social matrix that the vast majority of guys are stressing about, the thing that keeps them up at night, is dating and relationships.
For sure.
And the book takes a very hard, unsentimental look at the modern dating landscape.
It absolutely does.
Riker thoroughly analyzes the modern dating ecosystem, noting how the advent of ubiquitous digital apps like Tinder and Bumble, combined with algorithmic matching, have fundamentally and permanently altered human courtship. The book argues that these technologies have created a hyper-competitive, superficial marketplace that deeply disadvantages the average man.
Yeah.
Riker identifies and dissects several specific modern dating pitfalls that men must navigate. He talks about ghosting, where a woman you've been seeing simply vanishes without explanation, leaving the man in a state of psychological limbo. He dissects the friend zone, describing it as a miserable platonic purgatory where a man provides all the emotional support of a boyfriend but receives none of the romantic or sexual benefits, usually because he was too afraid to state his intentions early on.
He also mentions pocket dialing, which in the context of this book refers to a manipulative tactic where a person is kept on the back burner, receiving just enough sporadic attention to stay interested while the other person pursues better options. And then he talks about the Twilight Zone.
The Twilight Zone is rough.
Let's paint a picture of what that looks like. Imagine you meet a woman, you go on 3 great dates, but then her text replies start taking 12 hours. When she does reply, it's just one word. When you try to make plans, she says, "I'm just really busy right now, let's play it by ear." You are trapped in the Twilight Zone, an anxiety-inducing limbo of uncertain commitment where you don't know if you were dating, breaking up, or just an option.
It's a terrible place to be.
Riker's advice here is ruthless. A red-pilled man does not tolerate the Twilight Zone. His time is too valuable. He recognizes the behavioral shift, he matches her energy, he pulls his attention away completely, and he refocuses on his own purpose. Furthermore, the book shares a sobering statistic regarding long-term commitments, noting that up to 15% of married couples are actively experiencing sexless marriages.
Which Riker attributes to a complete collapse of polarity and traditional gender dynamics within the home.
Right. To combat all of this chaos and potential misery, the book breaks down the red-pilled approach to dating into 2 distinct categories: the inner game and the outer game. Your inner game is your absolute foundation. It consists of your unshakable self-confidence, your physical fitness, your financial stability, and most importantly, your overarching life purpose. If your inner game is weak, if you are needy, insecure, and lack direction, no amount of pickup lines will save you. The outer game, on the other hand, is the tactical, observable side of courtship. This involves mastering the nuances of reading female body language, engaging in playful, challenging banter rather than boring interview-style questions, and understanding the subtle nonverbal signals of attraction and disinterest. Riker argues that mastering both is essential.
But as he dives into the psychology of attracting success, Riker brings in a concept that might genuinely surprise some readers who expect a purely mechanical, cynical approach: the law of attraction.
Yeah, I found that section really interesting.
Now, he knows his audience, so he goes out of his way to frame it not as new age nonsense or some feminine wishful thinking idea. He actively works to ground the concept in hard science. He specifically mentions Max Planck, the father of quantum theory and principles of quantum physics, arguing that on a subatomic level, your thoughts, your focus, and the energy you project genuinely shape the reality and the opportunities that manifest around you.
So it's about energy projection.
If you project desperation and scarcity, you will attract rejection. If you project abundance, competence, and joy, you will attract high-quality people.
To make this abstract concept concrete, the author uses the life of Steve Jobs as a primary illustration of this high-level mindset. When Jobs was notoriously fired from Apple, the very company he founded in the 1980s, it was a massive, humiliating public defeat. A man with a weak mindset would have wallowed in self-pity, played the victim, and faded into obscurity.
But Jobs didn't do that.
Jobs did the opposite. He channeled that intense adversity and anger into a singular motivation. He founded NextT and acquired Pixar. The book frames this as the ultimate practical application of the law of attraction, relentlessly focusing your energy, your anger, and your intellect purely on the things you can control, thereby manifesting phenomenal success and eventually returning to conquer the company that exiled you.
Another vital psychological tool the book emphasizes for navigating this chaotic social matrix is the strategic use of humor. Riker advises his readers to cultivate a sharp wit and use humor as a psychological shield against a hostile culture. To illustrate the profound power of this, he references Viktor E. Frankl, the brilliant psychiatrist who survived the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps and wrote Man's Search for Meaning.
That's a powerful example.
The text notes how Frankl observed that the prisoners who were able to find dark humor in their nightmarish situation, who could still laugh at the absurdity of their suffering, were often the ones who maintained the will to endure. Humor is framed as the ultimate assertion of mental freedom. If you can laugh at a situation, it does not completely own you.
However, the book offers a very specific, pointed warning about the type of humor a red-pilled man should employ. Riker warns explicitly against what he calls unred-pilled humor. He advises that you should absolutely avoid engaging in or laughing at humor that caters to modern safe spaces or the restrictive rules of political correctness.
Right, you can't conform to their rules.
He argues that nervously laughing along with jokes that subtly reinforce cultural Marxist ideals or jokes that denigrate traditional masculinity just to fit in with a corporate crowd deeply undermine your own psychological progress. You are essentially agreeing to your own degradation. Instead, you have to keep your humor sharp, unapologetic, and red-pilled, using satire, irony, and biting sarcasm to expose the hypocrisy and absurdity of the prevailing societal narratives.
It's about using humor as a weapon of truth, rather than a tool for compliance.
Exactly.
When you look at all of this together, all of these meticulous steps, the rigorous habit tracking, the ruthless financial discipline, the physical combat training, the networking, the dating strategies, the psychological shields, they all synthesize into one overarching monumental goal. The ultimate objective of the book is not just to get a girlfriend or make a quick buck. It is about finding your unique, driving life purpose and achieving a state of absolute, unassailable self-reliance.
That synthesis, that holistic approach to life, is the core value proposition of Redpill Mastery. The book is painstakingly designed to take a man from a state of societal conditioning, profound confusion, and quiet desperation, and forge him into a state of absolute autonomy.
It is fundamentally a survival guide.
It is. It provides a comprehensive, deeply detailed, step-by-step blueprint for dismantling the blue pill illusions that have been fed to him since childhood and constructing a new, formidable life based on cold rationality, traditional masculine virtues, robust financial independence, and ironclad emotional resilience. It's meant to help men break the chains of what the author views as heavily captured institutions and a culture that is actively hostile to their flourishing.
And remember, you guys, this deep dive, as extensive as it has been, only scratched the absolute surface of the source material. We covered a massive amount of ground today, from the Frankfurt School to the habit loops of Tim Ferriss. But the actual step-by-step blueprint provided in the book goes into so much more granular detail.
Oh, way more.
It provides the exact frameworks, the specific exercises, and the daily protocols on how to actually implement these massive philosophical changes in your daily life. If you genuinely want to fully break the chains of societal conditioning, as Conrad Riker describes it, you need to engage with the full text. But before we sign off today, we always want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over as you go about your week, based on the dense material we've discussed today.
Here is something deep to consider regarding the philosophy we just unpacked. If the blue pill is an illusion crafted by captured institutions designed to control your behavior, and the red pill is a new, rigid ideology structured by authors like Riker with its own set of rules and expectations, how does a truly independent thinker ensure they are living authentically?
How do you guarantee that you are actually forging your own unique path, rather than simply trading one set of societal programming for another?
It is a question that requires continuous self-reflection, constant questioning of your own motives, and absolute intellectual honesty. That is a phenomenal, challenging question to leave you with. Think about it. Do not just accept anything blindly. And while you are thinking about it, I am going to tell you one more time to take action. Check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy the ebook Redpill Mastery, the definitive guide to winning at life. You also need to stay up to date with the author's ongoing writings, so follow at Conrad Mercheraker on Substack.
Highly recommend it.
Thank you so much for joining us on this extensive deep dive. Please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the show so we can keep bringing you these intense, comprehensive breakdowns. Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp, and keep seeking the truth.